Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The air on the porch of the Blackwood Ranch was thick with a tension colder than the approaching storm. Silas Blackwood stood as immovable as an ancient oak, his body a shield between the two figures behind him and the man on the black horse. His hand hovered near the worn leather holster at his hip, not out of aggression, but from an instinct sharpened by war and loss. Behind him, Elara Vance held her daughter Lily's hand, her knuckles white but her spine straight as a rifle barrel. She was the reason this storm had come to their door. The man on horseback, Jedediah Kane, smiled a predator's smile, the legal document in his gloved hand looking more like a weapon than paper. "The law is a clear thing, Mr. Blackwood." Kane's voice slithered through the charged silence. "The girl belongs with her blood. You are harboring a fugitive, and her child." Silas's voice was low, a rumble of gravel and warning. "There's the law of paper, and then there's the law of what's right. This is my land, and these are my people. Your paper means nothing here." Kane's smirk widened as he looked past Silas, his eyes locking onto Elara. "We'll see what the federal marshal has to say. You can't protect her forever." The threat hung in the air, a promise of violence and ruin. A man who had already lost one family was now faced with losing another. How did they get here? How did this fragile peace become a battlefield? To understand the vow he was about to make, we must go back to the beginning. If you believe that true family is forged in fire and loyalty, not just blood, then stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, because the deepest loyalties are often tested by the most dangerous truths. Part 1. Echoes in a Silent House. Sevens. The storm that brought Elara Vance and her daughter Lily to Silas Blackwood's doorstep was a thing of biblical fury. It tore across the Wyoming Territory as if to scour the very memory of sunlight from the land, turning the vast, open prairie into a churning sea of mud and wind. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-whipped sheets that hammered the roof of the ranch house and rattled the window panes in their frames. It was a night unfit for any living creature, a night when ghosts of the past felt close enough to touch. Inside, Silas Blackwood sat by a dying fire, the ledger on the table before him untouched. He wasn't seeing the numbers. He was listening to the sounds of the house, the groan of the timbers, the whistle of the wind through an unseen crack, and the overwhelming, deafening silence where a woman's hum and a child's laughter used to be. For 3 years, since the fever had stolen his wife, Sarah, and their young son, the silence had been his only constant companion. It was a shroud he had wrapped himself in, a penance he paid every waking moment. The sudden, frantic knocking on his door was so alien it felt like a violation. It wasn't the sound of a lost traveler. It was the sound of pure desperation. His first instinct was to ignore it. No good came from the world outside his fences. His foreman, a grizzled old hand named Gus, had warned him about the red scorpions, a gang of rustlers growing bolder, striking ranches closer and closer to his own. A stranger on a night like this was a threat, plain and simple. He reached for the shotgun leaning against the hearth, its cold steel a familiar comfort, and moved toward the door. He unlatched it just enough to peer through a narrow crack, the lantern light spilling out onto a scene of utter misery. A woman, drenched and shivering, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. Her clothes were plastered to her thin frame, and she held the hand of a small child who was hiding behind her skirts, only a pair of wide, terrified eyes visible. "Please, sir." The woman's voice was barely a whisper against the gale, yet it carried a surprising strength. "Our wagon. It broke an axle a mile back. We just need a place to wait out the storm. A barn, a shed, anything." Silas's eyes, cold and assessing, swept over them. He saw the worn-out boots, the lack of a man, the absence of any luggage save for a single, soaked canvas bag. They were drifters. Runaways. Trouble. His jaw tightened. "I ain't running a charity," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Town's 10 miles east." The woman, Elara, flinched as if he'd struck her, but she didn't back down. She pushed the small girl, Lily, slightly forward. "It's not for me. It's for her. She can't make it in this. Please." It was the sight of the child that broke through his wall of stone. Lily looked up, her face streaked with rain and tears, and for a fleeting, agonizing second, Silas didn't see her. He saw his own son, Thomas, his small face looking up at him from a sickbed, his eyes just as large, just as frightened. A raw, ragged breath escaped Silas's chest, a sound he hadn't made in years. The grief was a physical thing, a phantom limb that ached with a pain that never subsided. He clenched his fists, the knuckles turning white, fighting an internal war that the woman on his porch could never understand. Every instinct screamed at him to slam the door, to lock it, to keep the world and its memories out. But he couldn't. He couldn't leave a child to the mercy of that storm. With a low growl of resignation that sounded more like a curse, he pulled the door open wide. "Get in," he grunted, turning his back on them before they could see the torment in his eyes. He didn't offer a welcome, no words of comfort. He just retreated to the shadows by the fireplace, the shotgun still held loosely in his hand, watching them as they dripped onto the floorboards of his shrine. Elara hesitated for a moment, then guided Lily inside, her relief so palpable it was almost a sound. The warmth of the room was a shock after the biting cold. It smelled of pine smoke, old leather, and a faint, lingering scent of dried roses that seemed woven into the very wood of the house. The silence inside was different from the storm's roar. It was heavy, weighted with unspoken history. The walls were bare except for a meticulously maintained rifle rack and a single, stark portrait above the mantelpiece. It was a painting of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a smile that seemed to watch the newcomers with a silent, sorrowful question. Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were trespassing on sacred ground. Silas gestured with his head toward the fire. "Dry yourselves. There's blankets in that chest." He spoke without looking at them, his attention fixed on the flames as if they held the answers to a question he was afraid to ask. He was a fortress, and he had just, against his better judgment, lowered the drawbridge an inch. Elara nodded, whispering a thank you that he didn't acknowledge. She led Lily to the hearth, peeling off the child's wet coat and wrapping her in a thick wool blanket from the chest. The blanket smelled of cedar and memories. As Lily began to thaw, her shivering subsiding, Elara looked around the room. It was a man's space, tidy but barren of any softness, save for that portrait. It was a house, not a home. It was a place where someone was waiting to die, and Elara, who had spent the last year running for her life, recognized the feeling all too well. She wondered, as she wrung out the hem of her dress, if they hadn't just traded one storm for another, far more dangerous one. The first few days at the Blackwood Ranch were an exercise in navigating silence. Silas moved through his house like a ghost, his presence large and intimidating, but his words almost non-existent. He would leave for the barns before sunrise and return after dusk, his face etched with a permanent exhaustion that had little to do with physical labor. He ate the simple meals Elara prepared, stew, biscuits, bacon, at the head of the long wooden table, his eyes fixed on his plate, never once complimenting the food or acknowledging her effort. It was a tense, unspoken arrangement. She and Lily had shelter, and in return, they were to be as invisible as possible. Elara understood. This was not a home she was being welcomed into. It was a wound, and they were salt water. She poured her energy into her work, cleaning the neglected corners of the house, mending worn clothes she found in a back room, and cooking with a quiet efficiency that asked for nothing. Lily, with the uncanny wisdom of a child who has known fear, was a model of quietude. She played with a small rag doll on the porch, her voice a low hum, always careful not to run or shout. Yet, it was Lily who first began to chip away at the ice. One afternoon, while Silas was oiling a saddle on the porch, his movements methodical and detached, Lily approached him. She held out a single, bright blue prairie lupine, its petals still holding a drop of morning dew. She didn't say a word, just held it out, a silent offering. Silas froze, his hands stilling over the leather. His gaze dropped to the flower, then to the small, hopeful face of the child. For a long moment, he did nothing, his expression unreadable. Elara watched from the kitchen window, her heart in her throat, expecting him to scold the girl or simply ignore her. Instead, after a hesitation that seemed to last an eternity, he slowly, almost reverently, took the flower from her. His large, calloused fingers, so accustomed to the rough tools of a rancher, were surprisingly gentle. He didn't smile, but he nodded once at Lily before tucking the flower into the band of his hat. He said nothing, but a conversation had taken place. A fragile truce had been declared. The real shift, however, came a week later. It happened with the sudden, brutal violence that was a part of life in the West. One of the younger ranch hands, a boy of no more than 18 named Billy, was trying to break a stubborn colt. The horse, spooked by a rattlesnake, reared and threw him, its hoof catching the boy's leg with a sickening crack. Gus, the foreman, and the other hands carried him into the main house, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly shattered and piercing the skin. He was pale with shock, his breathing shallow. "He's losing too much blood," Gus said, his face grim. "The dock is a day's ride from here. He ain't gonna make it that long." Silas stood over the boy, his face a mask of stone, but Elara could see the flicker of helplessness in his eyes. It was a look she had seen on the faces of men in field hospitals, a look that came when death was circling. Without a word, Elara pushed through the circle of stunned cowboys. "Boil water. Now," she commanded, her voice cutting through the panic with an authority that made them jump. "And bring me my bag. The canvas one. And whiskey. All you've got." She knelt beside Billy, her hands moving with a practiced calm. She tore strips from a clean sheet, her fingers assessing the wound with a clinical detachment. When Gus returned with her bag, she opened it to reveal not clothes, but carefully wrapped bundles of dried herbs, powders, and tinctures. The men stared, confused. "What in God's name is that?" Gus muttered. "Medicine," Elara said curtly, not looking up. She mixed a poultice of yarrow to staunch the bleeding and willow bark for the pain. She poured whiskey over the horrific wound to clean it, ignoring Billy's agonized scream. "Hold him down," she ordered Silas, and he obeyed without question, his strength pinning the delirious boy to the table. For the next hour, the kitchen became an operating theater. Elara, with a focus that was both fierce and terrifying, cleaned the wound, carefully picking out dirt and splinters. With Silas's help, she pulled the mangled leg straight, forcing the bone back into alignment with a grim crack that made every man in the room wince. She fashioned a splint from floorboards and leather straps, her knots tight and sure. Finally, she packed the wound with a thick, dark paste of comfrey and moss and bandaged it tightly. She stood up, her hands and apron covered in blood, her face beaded with sweat. The room was silent save for Billy's ragged, but steady, breathing. He was alive. Elara looked at Silas, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time. There was no fear in her gaze, only a weary challenge. "He'll need watching. The fever will come, but the bone is set, and the bleeding has stopped." Silas stared at her, then at the boy on his table, then back at her. The suspicion in his eyes, the cold distance, was gone. In its place was something new, something raw and unsettling. It was respect. He had seen her not as a desperate drifter, but as a survivor, a healer, a woman of hidden strength. The silence in the house was still there, but its nature had changed. It was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of awe. Part 2. The Rust and the Rose. Sevens. The week that followed was a quiet storm of its own. Billy's fever came as Elara had predicted, a raging inferno that threatened to consume him. The ranch hands, who had initially viewed Elara with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, now watched her with a kind of reverence. She moved with tireless purpose, rarely sleeping, constantly changing the boy's dressings, forcing sips of cool willow bark tea between his chapped lips, and murmuring words of encouragement when he thrashed in his delirium. She had transformed Silas Blackwood's kitchen table from a place of silent, solitary meals into a center of healing, a bastion against death. Silas found himself a reluctant observer in his own home. He would stand in the doorway for long stretches, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hand, watching her. He watched the way her hands, though gentle, were firm and sure as she cleaned the wound. He watched the exhaustion carve new lines around her eyes, yet she never faltered. He saw a strength in her that mirrored the unforgiving land they lived on, resilient, practical, and utterly unyielding. His respect, born from the shock of that first night, began to deepen into something more complex. He started leaving a fresh bucket of water by the door for her each morning and made sure the woodbox by the stove was always full without her having to ask. They were small, unspoken gestures, a language he was more comfortable with than words. He was a man who understood actions, and her actions spoke of a profound capacity for care that he believed had vanished from the world, and from his own heart. One evening, after Billy's fever had finally broken and he was resting in a peaceful, natural sleep for the first time, Elara was cleaning the last of the bowls at the wash basin. She was so tired she swayed on her feet. A chair scraped behind her. She turned to see Silas holding out a steaming mug. "Drink," he said. It wasn't a request. She took it, her fingers wrapping around its warmth. It was coffee, strong and black, just the way she'd seen him take it. He had made it for her. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "Gus says you're a miracle worker," he stated, his gaze not quite meeting hers. "I'm not," she replied, her voice soft. I've seen a lot of this before. My father was a doctor, back in Georgia, during the war. The admission hung in the air between them, the first piece of her past she had offered him. The war. It was a chasm that separated them, a Confederate doctor's daughter and a Union cavalryman. Yet, in this moment, it was also a bridge. He knew the landscape of her knowledge was born from the same crucible of suffering that had forged him. "He taught you well," Silas said, the words costing him an evident effort. He turned to leave, the conversation already more than he was accustomed to. At the doorway, he paused. "The boy will live. Thanks to you." He was gone before she could reply. Elara stood alone in the quiet kitchen, the warmth of the mug seeping into her cold hands. It was the first time he had truly acknowledged her as more than an intrusion. Meanwhile, a quieter alchemy was at work between Silas and Lily. The little girl, seeing that her mother was consumed with caring for Billy, began to seek out the ranch's solemn master. She would follow him as he did his chores, a small, silent shadow. She never demanded his attention, but her presence was a constant, gentle pressure. She would hand him a misplaced nail when he was fixing a fence post or simply sit on a hay bale in the barn, watching him groom his horse. One afternoon, he was whittling a piece of scrap wood, his knife carving away his restlessness. Lily sat nearby, watching his hands. When he was done, he had carved a crude but recognizable little bird. He sanded it smooth with a piece of leather and, without a word, held it out to her. Lily's eyes widened. She took the wooden bird, her small fingers tracing its simple lines as if it were a treasure. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, the first genuine, unguarded smile Silas had seen from her. And though his own face remained a stony mask, something inside him, something rusted shut for years, creaked open just a little. The rose was beginning to bloom in the heart of the rust. With Billy on the mend and moved to the bunkhouse under the care of a grateful Gus, a fragile peace settled over the Blackwood ranch. The heavy silence of grief began to be replaced by the softer sounds of life. The scrape of Lily's wooden bird along the porch rail, the rhythmic thump of Elara kneading dough in the kitchen, the low murmur of conversation that no longer felt strained. Silas found himself lingering in the house a little longer in the mornings, taking his time with his coffee instead of escaping to the solitude of the barns. He was still a man of few words, but the space between those words was no longer filled with anger. It was filled with a watchful curiosity. He learned about Elara in fragments, through the things she did. He learned of her resourcefulness when she started a small herb garden by the kitchen door. He learned of her quiet strength when she mended his work shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. And he learned of her deep, abiding love for her daughter in the way her entire being would soften whenever she looked at Lily. The turning point in their own relationship came on a warm afternoon, under the shade of a lone cottonwood tree by the corral. Silas was tending to Seraphina, the aging mare that had belonged to his wife. The horse was old, her coat faded, one eye clouded over with milky blindness, but Silas treated her with a reverence he showed nothing else. He brushed her down with long, slow strokes, his voice a low murmur that only the horse could hear. Elara approached, carrying a pitcher of lemonade. She had learned he wouldn't seek refreshment, but he would accept it if offered. He took the glass she poured, his knuckles brushing hers for a fleeting second, a spark of warmth in the afternoon heat. "She was your wife's, wasn't she?" Elara asked softly, her gaze on the gentle old horse. Silas stiffened for a moment, surprised by her directness. He gave a curt nod. Her name's Seraphina. Sarah named her. Said she looked like an angel when she ran. He ran a hand down the mare's neck. This old girl, she's all I have left of her that's still breathing. Elara reached out, her own hand coming to rest on the horse's flank, near his. She grieved, too, after Sarah passed. Silas continued, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. Wouldn't eat for a week. Just stood in the pasture, staring at the house. Animals no loss. Sometimes better than we do. The confession, so raw and unexpected, opened a door. My husband, the man I thought would be my husband, he left before Lily was born, Elara said, her own voice quiet. His name was Samuel. He was a good man, I thought. A quartermaster's aide. He promised us a life, a future. Then he got tangled up with the wrong people, men who cared more for profit than for honor. He disappeared one day. Just gone. She looked out across the prairie, her eyes seeing a past he couldn't imagine. I waited. For a long time, I thought he'd come back. But all that came was trouble in his place. That's when I started running. Silas listened, his expression unchanging, but his eyes, when he looked at her, held a new depth of understanding. He wasn't just seeing a drifter anymore. He was seeing a woman who had also been betrayed by a world she thought she could trust. We all run from something, he said, his gaze dropping to the clouded eye of the horse. I came out here after the war to forget. Thought I could build a life so different from the one I'd left that the ghosts couldn't cross the mountains. But they did. He took a deep breath, the air shuddering in his lungs. Losing my troop at Shiloh, that was one kind of hell. But watching my own wife and son waste away from a fever I was helpless to fight, that's a hauntin' that never leaves you. They stood there in silence, their hands resting on the same loyal old horse, two survivors from different wars, sharing their scars under the vast, indifferent sky. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of a future. It was something quieter, more profound. It was the recognition of a shared pain, an unspoken understanding that they were both trying to mend a world that had been shattered. When Elara finally took the empty glass and walked back to the house, Silas watched her go. For the first time, he wasn't watching a stranger. He was watching a woman who knew the language of ghosts as well as he did. And for the first time, the silence that followed didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. Part 3. A storm on the horizon. Sevens. The peace was a fragile, sun-drenched thing, and like all beautiful things in the West, it wasn't meant to last. The first sign of trouble was subtle, a discordant note in the rhythm of the ranch. It started with the cattle. They grew restless, lowing uneasily in the night, their dark shapes shifting and bunching together in the pastures as if sensing a predator. Gus found tracks near the northern fence line, shod horses, not wild mustangs, but they vanished in the rocky terrain. Red scorpions, I'd wager, he'd said to Silas, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. They've hit 3 ranches north of here in the last month. Getting bold. They're testing our defenses, seeing how close they can get. Silas doubled the night watch, his own senses sharpening to a razor's edge. The quiet comfort he had started to find within his own home now felt like a liability, a softness that could be exploited. He began carrying his sidearm again, even just to walk from the house to the barn. The war had taught him that the quietest moments were often the prelude to the loudest violence. Elara felt the change in him immediately. The walls he had begun to lower were being rebuilt, brick by silent brick. He grew distant again, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his conversations with Gus held in low, serious tones. A sense of being watched crept over the ranch, a palpable menace that clung to the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. One evening, Elara was returning from her herb garden as twilight bled across the sky when she saw it. A flicker of light from a high butte that overlooked the ranch, miles away. A reflection from a spyglass. She froze, her blood running cold. She had seen that glint before, in the weeks before she fled her last town. It was the look of a hunter studying his prey. She said nothing to Silas, not wanting to add to his burdens with what might have been just a trick of the light, but the fear, a cold and familiar companion, settled back into her heart. The tension finally snapped on a moonless night. The dogs began to bark, a frantic, furious sound that was cut short by a choked-off yelp. Then, silence. A heavy, unnatural quiet. Silas was out of his bed in an instant, pulling on his boots, his rifle in hand. "Stay inside. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me," he commanded Elara, his voice a low, urgent growl. She herded a sleepy, frightened Lily into the small root cellar beneath the kitchen, handing her the wooden bird Silas had carved. "You stay here and be quiet as a mouse until Mama or Mr. Silas comes for you. Understand?" Lily nodded, her eyes huge in the flickering candlelight. Elara locked the heavy cellar door from the outside and grabbed the largest butcher knife from the block. Her hands weren't shaking. Fear had been her teacher for too long. It had taught her to be cold, to be focused. From the window, she could see shadows moving in the dark, flitting between the corral and the barn. Then, a torch flared to life, its orange light painting a grotesque, dancing scene. Men on horseback, their faces covered with red bandanas. The Red Scorpions. A gunshot cracked through the night, followed by another. The battle for the Blackwood Ranch had begun. Gus and the other hands were returning fire from the bunkhouse, their positions giving them some cover. Silas was a phantom in the dark, using the shadows of the outbuildings to his advantage, his rifle barking with deadly accuracy. He moved with the lethal grace of a seasoned soldier, a man who was no stranger to the grim choreography of a firefight. The attackers were professionals, not just drunken bandits. They moved with coordination, trying to draw fire in one direction while another group set fire to the hay barn. The flames roared into the night sky, a terrifying beacon of destruction, casting the entire ranch in a hellish, wavering light. Elara watched from the kitchen window, her heart pounding against her ribs. She felt helpless, trapped. But as she saw two of the raiders break away from the main group and start moving deliberately toward the main house, her fear transformed into a cold, hard rage. They weren't just here for cattle. They were coming for the house. They were coming for her and Lily. The two raiders moved with a sinister confidence, using the blinding light from the burning barn to mask their approach to the house's dark side. Elara's breath hitched. Silas and his men were pinned down, their attention focused on the larger group. No one saw these two. They were coming for the house, for what was inside. Her mind raced. The shotgun Silas kept by the door. She'd seen him clean it, knew how it worked in theory. Her father had taught her to shoot a pistol once, a lifetime ago. But this was different. This was not theory. This was a heavy, 12-gauge reality. She scrambled for the gun, its weight unfamiliar and terrible in her hands. She checked the breech as she'd seen Silas do. 2 shells. She wouldn't get a second chance. She took up a position by the side of the kitchen window, peering through the sliver of space between the curtain and the frame. The men were close now, their cruel laughter carrying on the smoke-filled air. One was a big, brutish man. The other was smaller, quicker, a knife gleaming in his hand. They were at the back door. The latch rattled. It held. A heavy boot kicked the wood, making the whole frame shudder. Then another kick, and the lock splintered. The door flew open. At that exact moment, Silas, having seen their flanking maneuver, made a desperate move. He broke cover, running across the open yard to intercept them, his rifle firing. He dropped the larger man, but the second one, the one with the knife, was already inside the house, diving into the kitchen's shadows. Elara heard a scuffle, a grunt of pain, and saw Silas stumble through the doorway, clutching his side where the raider's knife had slashed him. The attacker was on him in a second, a wild look in his eyes, raising the knife for a finishing blow. Time seemed to slow down. There was no thought, only instinct. The primal, ferocious instinct of a mother protecting her child. Elara stepped out from her hiding place, raised the shotgun, and pulled the trigger. The roar inside the small kitchen was deafening, the kickback slamming her hard against the wall. The raider was thrown backward as if by an invisible fist, a stunned look on his face before he collapsed in a heap. The sudden, shocking violence left a ringing silence in its wake. Outside, the remaining rustlers, seeing their leaders fall and their element of surprise lost, broke off the attack, melting back into the darkness from which they came. The fight was over. Silas leaned against the doorframe, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hand pressed against the bleeding gash on his side. He stared at Elara, who stood pale and trembling, the heavy shotgun still clutched in her hands, smoke curling from its barrel. He looked at the dead man on his floor, then back at her. The woman who had healed his ranch hand with herbs had just saved his life with a blast of buckshot. A new, unbreakable bond was forged between them in that moment of shared violence. The next morning, as the sun rose on the smoldering ruins of the barn, a new rider approached the ranch. He wasn't a raider. He was dressed in a clean, dark coat, his boots polished, riding a fine black horse. He moved with an air of arrogant authority. It was Jedediah Kane. He dismounted, taking in the scene of destruction with a cold, appraising eye. Sheriff Brody, having been summoned at dawn, was already there, questioning a weary Silas. Kane walked directly toward them, a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Sheriff," Kane said, his voice smooth and controlled. "A terrible business. I came as soon as I heard there was trouble." Silas's eyes narrowed. "How did you hear so fast?" "News barely reached town." Kane ignored him, addressing the sheriff. "It's as I warned you. This is no place for a child. I have here a legal writ from a judge in Santa Fe, granting me temporary custody of my cousin's daughter, Lily Langdon, on account of her mother, Elara Vance, living in an unstable and dangerous environment." He held out the papers. This was the true attack. The firefight in the night was just the opening salvo. Kane's timing was too perfect, his arrival too calculated. A sickening realization dawned on Silas. Kane wasn't just taking advantage of the raid. He was connected to it. The attack wasn't for cattle. It was to create the very instability Kane was now using against them. This wasn't just a legal battle over a child. This was a war against a man who used outlaws as his pawns and the law as his weapon. Silas looked from Kane's smug face to Elara, who had just emerged from the house. He saw the terror in her eyes, but also the same steely resolve he'd seen the night before. His personal fight to heal from his past had just become a fight for a future he hadn't even known he wanted. His passive acceptance of Elara and Lily had just transformed into an active, defiant declaration of war. He stepped forward, planting himself between Kane and the house. His wound throbbed, but his voice was steady. "You'll take her over my dead body." The midpoint had been crossed. The true enemy had shown his face, and the stakes were no longer just survival, but the very soul of a family. Part 4. The Shadow of the Law. Sevens. The morning sun did little to warm the cold reality that had settled over the Blackwood Ranch. The smoke from the ruined barn still tainted the air, a constant reminder of the violence of the night before, but it was the silent, legal threat posed by Jedediah Kane that cast the longest shadow. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary face showed the map of 1,000 similar conflicts, studied the writ Kane had presented. He was a man of the law, and the paper was official, the seal authentic. His personal feelings, his gut instinct that told him Silas Blackwood was an honorable man and Kane was a snake, meant little in the face of a judge's signature. "Silas, I don't like this any more than you do," Brody said, his voice low as he handed the document back to Kane, who accepted it with a triumphant smirk. "But this writ is legal. It gives you, Mr. Kane, the authority to claim the child." He held up a hand to silence Silas's immediate, furious protest. "However, it's based on the claim of an unfit environment. An accusation. It's not a final verdict. I'm not about to let any man ride onto a ranch that was just attacked and take a child from the people who defended her." He turned his hard gaze on Kane. "I'll give you 1 week, Silas. 7 days. You find me proof that this man's claim is fraudulent, or you find a counter-order from a circuit judge. You do that, and I can tear this damn thing up. But if you can't, my hands will be tied. I'll have to enforce it." The deadline fell between them like a hangman's noose. 7 days. An impossible amount of time to unravel a conspiracy that Kane had likely spent months weaving. Kane's smile never wavered. "A week seems more than generous, Sheriff. Justice will be served." He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away, not with the haste of a victor, but with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knows he has already won. The departure of the sheriff left a vacuum of dread. The remaining ranch hands, led by Gus, began the grim work of dousing the last embers of the barn and assessing their losses, but a cloud of futility hung over their labor. What was the point of rebuilding a fence if the heart of the home was about to be torn out? Inside the house, the silence was heavier than it had ever been. Elara moved with a numb, mechanical precision, cleaning the blood from the floorboards where the raider had fallen. Every scrub of the brush was an act of penance. She was the cause of this. Her past, the trouble she had been running from, had finally caught up and set fire to the first place she had dared to feel safe. She had brought this destruction down on a good man, a man who had shown her a kindness she no longer believed existed. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in a chair by the kitchen window, the butcher knife resting on the table beside her, watching the darkness, her mind racing. There was only one solution. She had to disappear again. She could not let Silas lose everything because of her. If she and Lily were gone, Kane would have no reason to stay, no leverage to use against this ranch. It was the same logic that had kept her moving for the past year, a logic of sacrifice and flight. Before the first hint of dawn, she began to pack. It was a familiar, heartbreaking ritual. She moved silently through the dim house, gathering their few meager belongings into the same canvas bag she had arrived with. She took the small wooden bird Silas had carved for Lily, tucking it carefully into a fold of cloth. It was the only treasure they had. She wrote a short, simple note, the words blurring through her tears. "Thank you. For everything. We cannot let you fight our battle. Forgive me." She left it on the kitchen table, a final, inadequate testament to her gratitude and her sorrow. She crept into the small room where Lily slept, her heart aching with a pain so intense it was difficult to breathe. She gently woke the child. "Hush, my love," she whispered, pressing a finger to Lily's lips. "We have to go on a trip. A quiet one." Lily, accustomed to these sudden, hushed departures, simply nodded, her eyes full of a sleepy, unquestioning trust that broke her mother's heart. Elara lifted her into her arms, the child's warmth a painful reminder of what she was trying to protect and what she was forcing her to endure. She was a fugitive, and she was turning her daughter into one, too. With Lily in her arms and the bag over her shoulder, she moved toward the back door, a ghost preparing to vanish into the pre-dawn mist. She was a breath away from freedom, a breath away from abandoning the only man who had ever truly stood for her. She had her hand on the latch when his voice came out of the shadows, stopping her cold. Running again. Elara. Silas was sitting in the dark at the far end of the room, a rifle laid across his lap. He hadn't been asleep. He had been waiting. She froze, her back to him, unable to face the accusation in his voice. "It's the only way," she whispered, her voice choked with unshed tears. "He'll leave you alone if we're gone. He'll follow us, and this will all be over for you. Turn around," he said. It wasn't a harsh command, but it held an undeniable weight. Slowly, she turned, Lily still held tight against her chest. In the faint, gray light of the approaching dawn, she could see the exhaustion on his face, the dark smudges under his eyes. The wound on his side was bandaged, a stark white slash against his dark shirt. "You think this is just about you and the girl?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "You think that man, Kane, will just pack up and leave if you run? He set fire to my barn. He paid men to try and kill my hands, to kill me. This stopped being your battle the second he stepped foot on my land." He stood up, the movement slow and pained, and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes locking onto hers. "I spent 3 years hiding in this house, running from a war I'd already survived and ghosts I couldn't fight. I was dead, Elara. I just hadn't stopped breathing yet. Then you showed up. You and that little girl. And you brought this house back to life, whether I wanted you to or not." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently brush a stray piece of hair from Lily's sleeping face. "He's not just trying to take your daughter," Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, filled with a raw intensity she had never heard before. "He's trying to put out the only light I've seen in years, and I will not let him do that." Elara's resolve crumbled. The tears she had been holding back began to fall freely. "But what can we do?" she sobbed. "He has the law on his side. We only have 7 days." At that moment, Gus knocked and entered. his face grim. "Silas, a rider from town just came. Brought this for you." He handed Silas a sealed envelope. Silas tore it open. As he read the letter, his face darkened into a mask of cold fury. He handed the paper to Elara. It was from Kane. The words were slick and venomous. "Mr. Blackwood, I am a man who appreciates history. I've learned of your command at the Battle of Shiloh. A tragic affair. So many of your own men, cut down in a poorly planned retreat. A court-martial was considered, I hear. It would be a shame for those old, buried reports to find their way to the desk of a federal marshal. But perhaps we can come to an arrangement. Give me the girl, and your secrets remain buried with your men." It was a checkmate. Kane had not only cornered them with the law, but now he was using Silas's own ghosts as a weapon. Elara looked at Silas, expecting to see defeat in his eyes. Instead, she saw fire. He took the letter from her trembling hands and crumpled it into a tight ball. He walked to the stove, opened the grate, and tossed it into the embers. They watched it blacken and turn to ash. "No more running," Silas declared, his voice ringing with a newfound clarity. He looked at Elara, his gaze unwavering. "Not for you, not for me. This is our home. We will fight for it. Together." It was a vow. A promise made in the half-light of a new day, witnessed by a child and an old cowboy. For the first time, Elara didn't feel like a fugitive seeking shelter. She felt like a partner in a war they would win, or die trying. The plan began to form, born from desperation and defiance. They couldn't fight Kane on his legal terms. They had to expose him for what he was, a criminal. "The Red Scorpions," Silas said, the pieces clicking into place. Kane knew about the attack. He had to be working with them. "If I can find proof, if I can link him to the rustlers, his whole case falls apart. The law won't protect him then." Gus nodded slowly. "Heard tales the Scorpions hole up in Crimson Gulch when they need to lay low. Lawless place. A man could get himself killed easy there." "It's a risk I have to take," Silas said. He looked at Elara. "I need you to hold the ranch while I'm gone. Can you do that?" She met his gaze, her own fear replaced by a fierce determination. "I saved your life once, Silas Blackwood. I can damn well look after your home." Sevens. Part 5. The Devil's Gambit. Sevens. The decision cast a new kind of silence over the ranch. It was not the silence of grief or tension, but the taut, humming silence of a plan set in motion. Every hour was precious. Silas had less than 6 days left. While Gus and the other hands worked to fortify the ranch, turning the main house and bunkhouse into a makeshift fortress, Silas prepared for his journey. He cleaned his Colt Peacemaker and his Winchester rifle with a grim focus, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the air. He packed light: jerky, a canteen, extra ammunition, and a bedroll. He was no longer just a rancher. He was the soldier he had once been, embarking on a mission behind enemy lines. The departure was quiet and heavy with unspoken words. Elara met him by the corral as he saddled Serafina. The old mare seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, standing unusually still. Elara pressed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle into his hand. "For the journey," she said. It was freshly baked bread and a small tin of the herbal salve she used for wounds. "I'm not a doctor," she added, a faint, sad smile touching her lips, "but it's better than nothing. He took it, his fingers closing over hers for a moment. "It's more than enough," he said, his voice gruff. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, his eyes memorizing her features in the morning light. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, about his gratitude, about the way she had reawakened his dormant heart, about his terror of failing her. But the words were stuck behind years of silence. Instead, he simply said, "Bar the door behind me. And trust Gus. He's a good man." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "You trust yourself, Silas. You're a better man than you think." He mounted Seraphina, the worn leather creaking under his weight. He gave one last look at the house, at the woman and child standing on the porch who had become his reason for everything, and then he turned the horse and rode west, not looking back. The ride to Crimson Gulch was a descent into a harsher, more brutal world. The rolling grasslands of his ranch gave way to jagged canyons and sun-scorched badlands, a landscape as scarred and unforgiving as the men who hid within it. Silas rode hard, the ticking clock of the sheriff's deadline echoing with every hoofbeat. He was acutely aware that he was leaving Elara and Lily vulnerable, protected only by an old foreman and a handful of cowboys. The thought was a spur that drove him onward, pushing him and his horse to their limits. Back at the ranch, a siege mentality took hold. Elara, proving her words were not an empty boast, became the heart of the defense. She worked alongside Gus, her intelligence and practicality earning the stoic foreman's grudging admiration. They boarded up the lower windows, created strategic firing positions, and stockpiled water and ammunition in the main house. She organized the men, assigning watches and duties, her calm authority a steadying force against their rising fear. She taught them how to make crude but effective bandages and which plants, crushed and applied to a wound, could help prevent infection. She was no longer a refugee. She was a chatelaine defending her castle. The days passed with agonizing slowness. Every distant cloud of dust on the horizon sent a jolt of fear through the defenders. Every night was a long, tense vigil, listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Lily, sensing the fear, stayed close to her mother, her small face serious. To distract her, Elara would tell her stories, not fairy tales, but stories of brave women who outsmarted their enemies, of queens who defended their homes with their wits. They were stories for Lily, but they were also a prayer for herself, a mantra of strength against the encroaching darkness. Kane, true to his nature, did not wait idly. He sent a rider with a message, another attempt at psychological warfare. The offer still stands. Blackwood. Your reputation, or the girl. You cannot save both. Elara intercepted the message. She read it, her face pale. Then, without a word, she crumpled it and threw it into the fire, just as Silas had done. Her message back to Kane was the silent, defiant slam of the heavy bar across the main door. The ranch was on its own, an island of defiance in a hostile sea, waiting for its champion to return or its enemies to breach the walls. Crimson Gulch wasn't a town so much as a festering wound on the face of the territory. It was a single, dusty street lined with ramshackle saloons and lean-tos, populated by men with dead eyes and secrets they'd kill to protect. This was the Red Scorpion's den, and Silas Blackwood walked into it like a man walking into a cage of wolves. He left Seraphina with the town's only blacksmith, a massive, one-eyed man who seemed to respect the fact Silas paid him in advance and didn't ask questions, and pushed through the swinging doors of the largest, loudest saloon. the devil's share. The music stopped. Every eye turned to him. They saw a stranger, a man who stood straighter and looked cleaner than their usual clientele. They saw a threat. Silas ignored the stares and walked to the bar. "Whiskey," he said to the bartender, a man with a long, greasy beard. As the bartender poured, Silas scanned the room. He was looking for a specific type of man, not the leaders, but the followers. The ones who drank too much, whose greed outweighed their loyalty. His eyes landed on a card game in the back corner. One of the players, a young man with a flashy silver buckle and a nervous tick, was losing badly. He looked desperate. That was his man. Silas bought a bottle and carried it over to the table. "Mind if I watch?" he asked, his voice casual. The table's enforcer, a hulking brute with a scarred face, grunted, but the young man, seeing the full bottle, shrugged. "Suit yourself." Silas watched for an hour, saying nothing, just observing the flow of money and whiskey. As he'd predicted, the young man, they called him Reno, lost everything. Cursing his luck, Reno shoved back from the table, ready to leave. Silas stepped into his path. "Tough run," Silas said sympathetically. "Let me buy you a drink for the road." Reno, suspicious but thirsty, agreed. At a small, secluded table, Silas poured them both a drink. "A man needs a steady income in these parts," Silas began, getting straight to the point. "Heard the Red Scorpions pay well for night work." Reno tensed. "Don't know what you're talking about." Silas smiled grimly and slid a small, heavy pouch of coins across the table. It was more money than Reno had seen in a year. "I'm not the law," Silas said. "I'm a businessman. Your boss, whoever he is, made a deal with another businessman, Jedediah Kane. I just need to know the details of that deal. A signed ledger, a letter, a witness who will talk for the right price. Help me, and this is yours. And there's more where that came from." Reno stared at the gold, his greed warring with his fear. The battle was short. While Silas bartered with a devil in a dusty saloon, the real devils were descending on the ranch. Kane, tired of waiting, had decided to force the issue. He arrived not with the law, but with a dozen hard men, their faces grim, a posse of hired guns. They surrounded the ranch house just as the sun began to set. "Elara Vance!" Kane's voice boomed across the yard. "Send out the girl, and no one else gets hurt." Inside, Elara's heart hammered, but her voice was steady as she spoke to Gus and the three other hands. "Hold your fire until they're close. Make every shot count. Aim for the horses first." It was a brutal but smart tactic. An unhorsed man was a slower target. The first wave of attackers charged, whooping and firing. From the windows of the house and the bunkhouse, the defenders answered. A horse went down, screaming. Another attacker clutched his shoulder and fell from his saddle. The initial charge was repelled. Kane, watching from a distance, scowled. He had underestimated the woman. He ordered his men to dismount and advance on foot, using the outbuildings for cover. The fight became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Hours crawled by. The defenders were running low on ammunition. One of the ranch hands was shot in the arm, and Elara had to drag him away from the window, quickly bandaging the wound under fire. They were losing. In Crimson Gulch, Reno had made his decision. "There's a ledger," he whispered, his eyes darting around nervously. The boss, Slater, He keeps a record of everything. Payments from Kane, lists of cattle we rustled. He's smart, keeps it as insurance. It's in a locked box in his room upstairs. Back at the ranch, the attackers had reached the house, using a heavy log as a battering ram against the front door. The wood was groaning, splintering. Gus looked at Elara, his old face streaked with sweat and gunpowder. It won't hold much longer. Elara looked toward the root cellar, where Lily was hidden. Her face was a mask of cold fury. Then they won't find us alive. At the saloon, Slater, the brutish leader from the card game, had noticed Reno's long conversation with the stranger. His eyes narrowed. He stood up, his hand going to the pistol at his belt, and started walking toward their table. Just as he approached, Silas slid the pouch of gold to Reno. "Go," he said. Reno grabbed the gold and bolted for the back door. Slater roared in anger, but his attention was now on Silas. "You've made your last mistake, stranger." Silas kicked the table over, sending cards and glasses flying, and drew his Colt. The saloon erupted into chaos. Back at the ranch, with a final, sickening crack, the front door burst inward. Kane stood on the threshold, a triumphant, evil grin on his face. "The game is over," he snarled. Elara stood alone in the center of the room, the empty shotgun in her hands, a final, defiant shield between the monster and her child. Part 6. A Home Forged in Fire. Sevens. The chaos in the Devil's Share Saloon was a maelstrom of overturned tables, shouting men, and exploding gunfire. Slater, the Scorpion leader, was a formidable beast, but Silas Blackwood was a different kind of animal. He was a soldier, and this was his battlefield. He moved with an economy of motion that was both beautiful and terrifying, using the chaos as cover. His Colt bucked in his hand, not firing wildly, but with deliberate, deadly purpose. Slater's men were thugs. They were no match for a trained cavalryman fighting for more than just his own life. While the gunfight raged, Reno, his loyalty bought and paid for, slipped upstairs. He returned moments later, a small, heavy metal box in his hands, just as Silas shot the pistol from Slater's hand, sending it spinning across the room. Silas grabbed the box from Reno without taking his eyes off the now disarmed and bleeding gang leader. "This is for the Devil's Share," Silas growled, before bringing the butt of his pistol down hard on Slater's head. The big man crumpled to the floor. Holding the box, Silas backed out of the saloon, his gun keeping the remaining outlaws at bay. He didn't stop running until he reached the blacksmith shop. He threw a few more coins to the one-eyed smith. "Keep them busy," he said, and the blacksmith, who had no love for the Scorpions, grinned and hefted a massive sledgehammer. Silas mounted Seraphina and spurred her into a desperate gallop, the precious ledger box clutched under his arm. He rode out of Crimson Gulch as the sounds of a new kind of mayhem, the kind only a giant with a sledgehammer can create, erupted behind him. The ride back was a blur of frantic, punishing speed. He pushed the old mare harder than he ever had before, whispering apologies and promises to her as they thundered across the dark prairie. He had the proof, but a gnawing terror consumed him. Would he be too late? Miles from his ranch, he nearly collided with another group of riders galloping hard through the night. He reined in Seraphina, his rifle up and ready, until he saw the familiar, weary face of Sheriff Brody. "Silas! What in the hell?" Brody began. "No time, Sheriff!" Silas panted, holding up the metal box. I've got it. Proof. Kane is behind the rustling. It's all in here. He pried the box open with his knife. Inside was the ledger, its pages filled with Slater's neat script, detailing dates, payments, and Jedediah Kane's name, clear as day. Brody's eyes went wide as he scanned a page under the moonlight. The lawman's weary cynicism was burned away by a cold, righteous anger. "Let's ride," Brody commanded his deputies. "Let's go serve a warrant of our own." At the ranch, the standoff in the ruined doorway was reaching its terrible conclusion. Kane advanced on Elara, his face contorted with rage at her continued defiance. "You have cost me a great deal of time and money, you stubborn witch," he spat. "But you will give me what I came for." "You will have to kill me first," Elara said, her voice low and steady, even as her heart threatened to beat its way out of her chest. She held the useless shotgun like a club, her last stand. "That can be arranged," Kane sneered, raising his pistol. He was savoring the moment, the final breaking of her will. From outside, a voice roared through the night, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. "Kane!" Silas launched himself from Seraphina's back before she even came to a full stop, his face a terrifying mask of vengeance. He flew through the broken doorway, a primal force of nature, and crashed into Kane, sending them both sprawling to the floor. The fight was short, brutal, and without mercy. It wasn't a duel, it was an execution. Silas, fueled by adrenaline and righteous rage, was relentless. His fists, hard as iron from years of ranch work, rained down on Kane. Behind him, Sheriff Brody and his deputies swarmed into the yard, quickly subduing Kane's stunned and outmaneuvered hired guns. The fight ended when Silas, breathing like a winded bull, dragged Kane's broken and whimpering form out onto the porch and threw him at Brody's feet. "He's all yours, Sheriff," Silas gasped. Brody looked at the bloody mess of a man, then at the ledger, and then back at Silas. He nodded grimly. "Justice will be done." Elara rushed out onto the porch, her eyes finding Silas's. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In the chaotic aftermath, under the cold, silent witness of the stars, they simply stood together, the space between them finally, blessedly, free of shadows. The war was over. The dawn that broke over the Blackwood Ranch was the first in a long time that didn't feel like a threat. It brought with it a sense of profound, bone-deep weariness, but also the clean, sharp clarity of a world remade. Kane and his men were gone, hauled away in chains by Sheriff Brody, the damning evidence of the ledger ensuring they would never trouble this land again. The immediate aftermath was a blur of quiet activity. Elara, her hands finally steady, tended to Silas's wounds, both old and new, her touch gentle but efficient. He, in turn, insisted on checking on Gus and the other hands, his quiet words of praise and gratitude for their loyalty more valuable to them than any bonus. When the work was done, and the sun was higher in the sky, a strange and wonderful thing began to happen. A wagon appeared on the horizon, then another, and another. It was the townsfolk, led by Sheriff Brody, who had spread the word of what had truly happened. They came not as gawkers, but as neighbors. The baker's wife brought fresh bread and pies. The blacksmith, having heard the tale, arrived with a wagon full of lumber and tools to help rebuild the barn. Women from the town surrounded Elara, not with questions, but with offers of help, with bolts of cloth, with quiet, understanding smiles. They had heard of her skill as a healer, of her bravery in the face of the attack. They saw not a fugitive, but a woman who had defended her home. They had come to welcome her into the community. That afternoon, the ranch, which had so recently been a battlefield, became a place of communal effort and quiet celebration. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the sound of gunfire. The smell of sawdust and baking bread replaced the smell of smoke and fear. Silas stood on his porch, watching it all, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He had spent years isolating himself, believing he was an island. But now, he saw that he was part of a larger landscape, a community he had forgotten he belonged to. Lily, finally coaxed from the root cellar, seemed to understand the shift better than anyone. She walked straight up to Silas, who was leaning heavily against a porch column, and slipped her small hand into his large, bruised one. He looked down at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, he gave her a true, genuine smile. It was a rusty, unfamiliar movement on his face, but it transformed him, chasing away the last of the ghosts from his eyes. He squeezed her hand gently. Later that evening, after the neighbors had departed, leaving behind the promise of their continued support, the three of them sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of purple and gold. The air was cool and peaceful. "Sarah would have liked you," Silas said quietly, his voice full of a gentle melancholy, not the sharp-edged grief of before. "She always said this house was too quiet. She would have loved the sound of Lily's laughter. She would have admired your strength." He finally told Elara about his wife, not as a ghost or a wound, but as a person, a memory full of love. He spoke of his son, his dreams for him. It was a final letting go, a sharing of his deepest heart. Elara listened, her hand resting on his arm, offering a silent comfort that was more powerful than any words. She knew she wasn't replacing a memory. She was helping to build a new life alongside it. Lily, curled up between them, was starting to fall asleep, the wooden bird clutched in her hand. "What will we tell people?" Elara asked softly. "When they ask who we are?" Silas looked at her, his gaze clear and sure in the twilight. He then looked at the little girl nestled between them. He gently rested his hand on Elara's back, a gesture of quiet possession, of promise. "We'll tell them we're family," he said. And on the porch of a home that had been broken and scarred, but was now, finally, whole, no truer words had ever been spoken. In the heart of the Wild West, a land of harsh justice and second chances, a home is rarely built from just wood and nails. It is forged in fire, cemented with loyalty, and built upon the foundation of a love brave enough to face down the ghosts of the past and the demons at the door. The story of Silas, Elara, and Lily is a testament to this truth. It reminds us that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we choose to fight for. It's a quiet vow whispered in the half-light of dawn, a shared glance across a battlefield, and the courage to build a new world from the ashes of the old. Their journey shows that even the most broken hearts can learn to beat again, and the most silent houses can once more be filled with laughter. In a land defined by hardship, their love became the ultimate act of defiance, proving that the most resilient thing to ever grow in the dust of the frontier is hope. If their story of courage and resilience touched your heart, there are countless more legends waiting to be told. Here at Wild West Love Stories, we bring you the epic tales of passion, sacrifice, and honor that define the American frontier. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and saddle up. Your next great love story is just a sunset away.